Hello and welcome to another video on Dragoon optimization. Today I'm going to talk about triple weaving and animation lock. I don't feel like super editing this or anything, so I'm mostly just going to talk about this, but I'll try to edit some stuff that helps out later. So recently, due to some stuff that happened on FF logs, a lot of people were talking about triple weaving and if there's any jobs that actually need to triple weave to be optimal and stuff. And the general consensus I saw from a lot of people is that there's actually no job in the game that really benefits from triple weaving on paper. And in general, I feel like a lot of people are, at least like with the perspective of Dragoon, undervaluing how important animation lock can be. So today I want to talk about how on Dragoon, having a lower animation lock can very directly improve your rotation. So there's going to be a couple ways how this can affect you. First of all, I just want to say that having a lower animation lock, or most of all being able to triple weave, makes the job a lot easier. You're able to make your burst windows way more compact, and the panic options, like for example, if you're about to use Drake's Bane and you just already did a weave of, let's say like Nostrana Wormwind Thrust, but you realize you have to life surge this GCD2 to be optimal, you can just do so, like you have more leeway on that. You can basically always just double weave. And then if you realize you need to press something like Wormwind Thrust or Nostrand or Life Surge, you can just panic press it and you're fine. So that's one advantage, but that's nothing, that's no gain on paper, that's just a convenience thing. So talking about the actual on paper potency gains, if you've seen my rotation videos, the standard one and the double Mirage Dive one, you might have seen my comment where I talk about, okay, cool. Where I mentioned that there's a few triple weaves you can do in the rotation to just instantly improve the potency. So the first one that happens is that at 3 minutes, you have a 4th hit into Lance Charge, into Drake's Bane, Gear Skogul, and then Right-In Thrust. And there's a Wormwind Thrust you have to press before this Right-In Thrust. So logically what you would want to do is to hold the Wormwind Thrust until after your Gear Skogul. So you have both the Lance Charge buff of 10% and the Life of the Dragon buff of 15% on the Wormwind Thrust. However, as you might see in the video, I don't actually do this. The reason is because in your opener in this rotation, you are doing Chaotic Spring and then Battle Litany and Gear Skogul. What that means is that for the rest of your rotation, assuming everything happens on cooldown and there's no drift or anything, it means that your Gear Skogul is already occupying the second weave slot. So for example, right, I do GCD and then Battle Litany and Leg Sweep. So Leg Sweep, if it was a Gear Skogul then, it is in the second weave slot, which means that even if I'm not weaving anything before it, like at 3 minutes, it is still going to be a triple weave, like in terms of the required animation lock, if you try to do Drake's Bane, Gear Skogul, and then Wormwind Thrust. However, if you are able to do this, you are strictly just gaining like 80 potency or something around there. So that's one example. Basically, all of these situations are going to resolve around either Wormwind Thrust or Life Surge, because both Wormwind Thrust and Life Surge are GCD dependent. And due to our buffs, due to the fact that we have 3 different buffs being Lance Charge, Battle Litany, and Gear Skogul or Life of the Dragon, and the fact that since buffs are multiplicative with each other, you always want to try and make them as compact as possible. You want to, since we have 3 buffs, generally press them within 2 GCDs. There are even cases where it's optimal to triple weave your 3 buffs together, which is another case. But generally speaking, you want to put all those 3 buffs within 2 GCDs. Which means that if after the final weaves, or just in general, if one of these weaves lines up with either a important Life Surge GCD or a point where you have to use Wormwind Thrust, you are essentially forced to then triple weave in order to gain the maximum potency in that situation. This happens at 4 minutes as well in the rotation, where we do, I think it's Battle Litany and Gear Skogul, and then you press Drake's Bane after, but because there's no weave space, we cannot use Life Surge here. And because we are using a Chaotic Spring combo afterwards, instead of a Heaven's Thrust combo afterwards, it means that In this situation, to avoid drift in your life surge cooldown, our best option is to instead life surge the chaotic spring GCD, which is because it fully buffed 340 potency GCD like CS or Lance Barrage or Forfeit, but usually only CS because, well, okay, so these GCDs are stronger than a unbuffed 440 potency. Although it's usually only going to be Chaotic Spring because Chaotic Spring is further away from a better option than the other two are. And in the other two situations, you are usually better off just holding it for one extra GCD, even if it's drifting. So that's one case, mainly just talking about the Wormwind Thrust wave and the Life Surge wave. I already mentioned it kind of before, but there are also cases where it's optimal, especially for speed kill perspective, right? For Parson, RDPS, and NDPS, I've noticed that in most cases, it's never really optimal to do triple wave buffs, where you use all three of your buffs within one GCD spin. But for speed kills, it's very often optimal because more important than your personal alignment, like getting future life surges or getting future Wormwind Thrusts under those early buffs, especially because putting something early in your buff window doesn't always apply to... Why am I getting FC invites? Doesn't always apply to all the raid buffs in your party, right? So if you're counting for raid buffs too, it's very often optimal to just stack all three of your buffs within one GCD and then make sure that every GCD within raid buffs is going to be fully benefiting from multiplicative values. So that's kind of a second case then. Next up is not necessarily triple wave, and this is once again back to just animation lock being lower in general, but it's like fight specific windows where there's downtime involved or phase timing or something. For example, your DSR phase 2 opener. In this opener, because the uptime of the first window, the first damage window before he does, what's it called? Strength of the Heavens, I think. The duration of this window is 31.9 seconds. You have 31.9 seconds where the boss is targetable before he becomes untargetable. So how we approach this is we pull the boss with high jump, which you can early pull by a little bit, and then TLDR, we gain another high jump at the end, which we're going to be pressing around 29.5 seconds due to the pre-pull. And then you have both Mirage Dive and Heaven's Thrust, which you want to press before the boss goes untargetable. If you do it in the logical order, that's going to be high jump, Heaven's Thrust, Mirage Dive, which means that assuming you have like the base animation lock, it means that you're pressing Mirage Dive at 30.9 seconds, which Mirage Dive has an application time of, I think, 0.8 seconds, something around there. I'm actually not sure off the top of my head, but it's like 0.8 seconds. So it's going to apply at like 31.7 seconds or 31.8 seconds, which is barely gonna still hit the boss before the 31.9 second threshold. So as you can imagine, if you do not have like XIV Alex or no Clippy, which I should have mentioned before, but there are tools which you can use, third-party tools such as XIV Alexander or no Clippy, or there's also some other ones that are less popular or like more niche and usually more game breaking, which I believe is called XIV Speeder, and then there's Boss Mod. I'm not sure like which ones are currently used, but yeah. So you can use these third-party tools to lower your animation lock, which is really cool because your animation lock in this game is affected by your ping to the servers, which means that you're generally at a disadvantage in your rotation, especially on Dragoon, because as I'm saying, there's a lot of situations on Dragoon where your animation lock actually matters. But you're able to fix that disadvantage by using these tools, which is the positive of them. The negative is that you're able to push it really far to a point where you're essentially simulating 0 MS ping or even lower. And in general, it's kind of a gray area depending on what you think, whether being able to triple weave is like legal or not, whether it should be possible. It is possible on vanilla, it's just very, very, very low ping requirement and not really realistic. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent. The point of this video is to explain why triple weaving does matter on Dragoon. So that's another example, DSR phase 2 opener. You basically have to change your opener if your animation lock isn't low enough to where you're ending on, for example, you're going to end on Mirage Dive into Chaotic Spring, which is a pretty significant potency loss, but because Chaotic Spring has a much faster application time than either Mirage Dive or Heaven's Thrust, it makes it much easier, and basically anyone should be able to hit that with pretty much any amount of ping. So yeah, that's another case. There's also more windows like that. Top has one, I think post Sigma or post Delta. I guess it's post Delta. But yeah, there's a lot of windows. Basically, anytime that a boss is set, has like a set duration for how long he's targetable, you're always gonna want to optimize around like the damage application of your final ability. And on Dragoon, that very often implies that you're gonna like clip certain OGCDs. Maybe you're gonna use an OGCD at the start before a GCD. If it's at the start of combat, you can do things which I've mentioned in different videos, like pulling with Piercing Talon, pulling with Doom Spike, or doing a mouse over GCD, stuff like that. You're always trying to barely squeeze in your final hit. It's almost always optimal, or with food swaps or whatever. So being able to do that faster and more easily is just a strict advantage. Another example of this is top phase 2. In your opener for top phase 2, you have both Omega F and Omega M targetable. And for the first 4.8 seconds, you can cleave both bosses. After 4.8 seconds, you instantly have a debuff applied to you. A packet filter debuff, which prevents you from doing damage to one of the two bosses. So all your damage has to apply before 4.8 seconds. Don't think I have to explain it much, but basically, on Dragoon here, you do a triple wave initially of you press your GCD. Then you do, generally speaking, your window is going to be Gear Skogul, Nastron, Dragonfire Dive, triple wave, which is always going to clip. It should always clip, even with FFXIV Alexander. That is accounted for. And then you do another GCD, and then you do Stardiver, which, assuming you do everything perfectly, and you have a base animation log of like 0.6 seconds on most actions, then you're going to hit your Stardiver at 4.5 seconds, which means you have a tiny little bit of leeway. But with people not doing things like retargeting the other boss or using a macro to hit their GCD immediately, which is stuff that I haven't even explained, I think, in different videos. I'm not actually sure. But anyways, having a lower animation log just makes this a lot more easy for you to do. And there's also the second cleave window on Limitless Synergy later on. Once again, your animation lock can affect how much potency you gain from cleave in here. So that's mostly that scenario then. The next one I want to talk about where you can gain potency is with raid buffs, and most specifically an Astrologian balance card. So although all raid buffs in the game have been adjusted with Dawntrail to be 20 seconds duration, and since our own buffs are also 20 seconds, we are already aiming to do all of our damage within 20 seconds, which means generally speaking we should be doing all of our damage within party raid buffs too. The balance card from Astrologian, which is a 6% buff, is still only 15 seconds. Which means that generally speaking, doing a normal 2-minute burst window on Dragoon, you're always going to be missing like at least one GCD worth of weaves in the balance card. Which can be like anywhere from like Mirage Dive and Nastron, which is at base 560 potency, but then you account for buffs and it's like over 700 potency. But in some cases, depending on how you play, it could be stuff like Starcross that's missing from their buff. If you triple wave, you can always guarantee that you get every single action in balance card. Which might not sound like a lot, but especially if you're getting multiple cards throughout a fight, it adds up a lot. And ironically, a triple wave in Dragoon actually goes up pretty hard in Astrologian card like priority, because we start doing so much damage in that 15-second window. It still depends on like what window we're doing, what GCD alignment we have. But Dragoon is actually really powerful when you're triple weaving. So although I said that all the other raid buffs are 20 seconds now, this still kind of applies to other raid buffs too, because even though they're all 20 seconds, they're not going to be used at the same time, right? Either just because you're playing with random people and they're just pressing it at random times, or because some jobs might have a reason, especially in like fight specific stuff. Like in an ultimate, Reaper might be tempted to use their raid buff early, even in later phases, because it gives them their gauge sooner and they need it for some reason. Either way, it's very likely that there's going to be times where the actual overlap, where you have every single raid buff in your party at that moment, is actually 15 seconds or less. So once again, triple weaving can help you put more into buffs in those situations. The next example I want to give is that when you have lower animation lock, you can finish your burst window at the end of a fight way faster. So pretty much, because a lot of our OG cities that we have in our burst window now are follow-ups or just things we have in general, the only actual cooldowns we really need to get out of the way is using our buffs with Lance Charge, Balladini, Gear Skogul, and then press in High Jump and Dragon Fire Dive. We can use one life surge outside of burst, and then the other life surge isn't that important. You can technically not get it off and it's not a massive deal. And besides that, we just have 3 Nostrons, which have a 2-second cooldown, and then we have Mirage Dive, Rise of the Dragon, Star Diver, and Starcross. All of these actions can be used immediately. So you have the simple option of simply just, you're going to triple weave every time that it's possible, maybe clip a little bit for your jumps even, but preferably you just put your 2 jumps, High Jump and Dragon Fire Dive, on the same GCD to minimize the amount of animation lock you're wasting on that GCD, and then for every other GCD you're trying to triple weave actions. This will already let you save a GCD or 2 on your burst, but because our OGCD actions are so much stronger than our GCD actions, it's actually quite likely that it's optimal for your end of fight burst. Let's say the boss is dying at like 8 minutes and 15 seconds, right? Or even sooner, like 8 minutes and 12 seconds. It's really likely that it's optimal for you to just forego pressing GCDs altogether, right? Just blast out Nostron, Star Diver, Starcross, Nostron, Wormwind Thrust, Dragon Fire Dive, Nostron, whatever, etc. The specifics of that depend, but it's genuinely very plausible that you will be doing stuff like that. And in a situation like that, every single weave is basically increasing the potency per second that you're doing. You are on paper gaining damage for every single weave when your animation lock is lower in that situation, which can add up so much that you're finishing your burst 1 or 2 seconds sooner than someone else. And someone with very high animation lock, which cannot even consider really to skip their GCDs, because the animation lock for their OGCDs is so high that it basically, like, they just have to double weave, right? And it aligns normally where they're not wasting much animation lock, so it makes sense to then press a GCD afterwards. So it's possible that they cannot get all their OGCDs out until a normal time of like 720 something, like 724, 725. Whereas you might have finished most of your burst already at like 715 or 716. Or, I mean 8 minutes. I was saying 7 minutes, but I mean 8 minutes. Another small example, this is really small, but it's still relevant, is Limit Break. This applies to other jobs too. Limit Break has an animation lock, and even though the animation lock is very long, the effect that your ping has on it doesn't really, like, it doesn't scale, right? Like, a longer animation lock isn't going to gain more animation lock because of higher ping. It's still going to be the same increment. But generally speaking, the GCD downtime that you get from pressing LB3 on Dragoon, or any melee, the GCD downtime is 6.3 seconds. Because it has a 4.5 second cast and a 3.7 second base animation lock, and you press it after the 0.6 seconds of your GCD animation lock. And then when you account for the leftover 1.9 seconds of GCD roll, it means you're sitting on your GCD for 6.3 seconds. Now, you're gaining opportunity cost by simply finishing the LB3 faster. If you get back into pressing your rotation button sooner, you get back into pressing your GCD roll sooner. It means you have a very slight chance of gaining a GCD at the end of the fight, which on paper is a very slight potency gain. But for Dragoon, it's kind of funny too, because so the power surge buff we get from Spiral Blow lasts for 31.35 seconds. 31.35, yeah. So because our GCD combo normally is 25 seconds to do a full loop, it means that when you take the difference in time from the duration in our combo loop, we need a total downtime from our GCD of 6.35 seconds for us to drop the power surge buff. Which means that very realistically, since normally like the best possible realistically animation lock you're getting, or GCD downtime you're getting when you LB3 is 6.3 seconds, it means that realistically anyone who isn't using XIV Alexander or no Clippy, and even with no Clippy you might honestly still be over this, you're gonna have a animation lock that is too long. It's gonna be over 6.35 seconds of GCD downtime, which means that assuming you alternate combos, you're gonna have to do a Spiral Blow without power surge, which is just a strict potency loss. Assuming that this Spiral Blow happens outside of your buff window, it means you're just losing 30 potency, and that's it. So the last example I want to give of how you can also lose kind of opportunity cost lose damage from having a lower animation lock is with gap closing, especially at the start of fight. Well, I say at the start of fight because this is almost always going to be relevant, but for example in M4 there's generally some disengages where you're going to be micro clipping your GCD, because the moment you can gap close back to the boss, your GCD is already coming back up, which means that the time where you are actually pressing your GCD is not dependent on your GCD roll itself, it's dependent on when you finish your animation lock from the gap closer. So TLDR, that's what it's about, is that if you have a lower animation lock on your gap closer, it means you can press your GCD sooner. At the start of combat, you can still press your gap closer at the exact same point of time, because you're still going to be spending the same amount of time traveling to the boss, but you will simply press your GCD sooner and prepare it sooner. It's simply just objectively better. So that's everything that I can think of off the top of my head on how Dragoon is gaining potency from having a lower animation lock. There might be something else, there might be multiple things, but I think this is enough to at least give people an understanding of why for Dragoon stuff like XIV Alexander and having lower animation lock is pretty important when you're optimizing. None of what I said in this video is really like game breaking, right? You can see people getting rank 1s on fights without doing any of these things, without doing any animation lock dependent stuff. Historically, there have been plenty of people that are like on top of both the speed kill meta and the parsing meta that don't necessarily use XIV Alexander or abuse these things. But that doesn't change the fact that it is just objectively optimal in pretty much every fight. Like, I don't think there's going to be a single fight in Dawntrail where there isn't at least one triple weave that's optimal. And as I mentioned, with the possibility of triple weaving all three of your buffs together, it is very plausible that you're going to be seeing logs with upwards of like 8 or 10 forced triple weaves to be completely optimal. So yeah, that was it. Mostly just a ranting video. I really hope I'm gonna edit stuff onto this, because I didn't end up doing anything in game. But yeah, thank you for listening. I hope this was informative, and I'll try to make more videos soon. Love you all. Goodbye. Have a nice day.